The candles in the Ashworth ballroom flickered against gilded mirrors on the evening of October the 12th, 1818, casting a warm glow that softened the faces of London's finest families, though Eleanor Ashworth knew that no such kindness would be extended to her own countenance. She stood near the column at the eastern edge of the assembly room, her position as familiar as her reflection, always on the periphery where widows of modest means and faded youth were expected to remain. The silk of her gown was a muted dove grey, well made but simple, the work of her own careful hands rather than a fashionable modiste, and she had long since ceased to mind the whispers that followed her entrance into such gatherings. She heard them still, of course, the murmured observations that drifted from clusters of matrons sipping champagne. How Mrs. Ashworth had once been pretty in an unremarkable way, but time had been unkind. How 20 years of widowhood showed in every line around her eyes and mouth. How it was admirable she still made the effort to attend, though surely she must know herself quite invisible to any gentleman of consequence. Eleanor had learned to let such words wash over her like rain against stone, eroding nothing because she had already surrendered the ground they sought to claim. She attended these events for one reason alone: her daughter Caroline, who had married just 6 months prior to Mr. Thomas Whitmore, a gentleman of respectable fortune and genuine kindness. Caroline stood now among the young wives on the opposite side of the room, her face bright with laughter, her rose silk gown catching the light as she moved, and Eleanor felt the familiar swell of fierce maternal pride that had sustained her through 2 decades of sacrifice. She had been 22 when her husband died, 3 years wed to a man 30 years her senior who had been kind but never passionate, and she had poured all the love in her heart into the infant daughter left in her care. Society had offered remarriage in those early years, modest proposals from aging widowers seeking a nurse or housekeeper in matrimonial disguise, but Eleanor had chosen independence and dignity over such arrangements. Now, at 42, she knew herself beyond even those lowly considerations. Her hair, once a simple brown, had silvered at the temples. Her figure, though still slender, had lost the suppleness of youth. Her hands showed the evidence of economies, of mending and household work undertaken without sufficient staff. She had made her peace with invisibility, had learned to find her satisfactions in books and gardening, and the quiet pleasure of watching her daughter thrive. The orchestra began a country dance, and Eleanor observed the sets forming, the careful social choreography of partner selection, the fluttering fans and strategic positioning of ambitious mothers. The room smelled of hothouse flowers and expensive perfumes, of beeswax candles, and the faint mustiness of wigs still worn by the older gentlemen. Someone laughed too loudly near the refreshment table. A young woman in white stumbled slightly in the dance and was steadied by her partner. Life continued in its glittering whirl, while Eleanor Ashworth stood witness from the shadows, expecting nothing more than she had learned to expect, which was nothing at all. She had been 19 when she married Mr. Henry Ashworth, a gentleman of adequate fortune and 49 years of age, a man who needed a wife to manage his household and who offered in return respectability and security that her own impoverished family could not provide. Eleanor remembered standing in her modest wedding gown of cream muslin, her mother's hands adjusting the simple veil, her father's relieved expression that his third daughter was finally settled, and she had told herself that affection might grow where passion was not expected, that kindness was perhaps a better foundation than the romantic love she had read about in novels borrowed from the circulating library. Henry had been kind, in his distant way, treating her with the courteous regard one might show a capable housekeeper, and when Caroline was born 10 months after their wedding, Eleanor had found the great love of her life in that squalling, red-faced infant, and decided she needed nothing more. Her husband's sudden death from an apoplexy when Caroline was barely 3 had shocked the neighborhood, but left Eleanor with an unexpected emotion beneath her proper grief. A guilty flicker of relief that she quickly suppressed and never examined too closely. The modest inheritance Henry left was enough for a small household if carefully managed, enough to raise her daughter in genteel poverty, enough to maintain the appearance of respectability while undertaking economies that ladies of higher rank would never consider. She had learned to trim her own bonnets and let out Caroline's gowns as the girl grew, had dismissed all servants except for a cook and a maid of all work, had walked rather than kept a carriage until Caroline's debut season made some show of transportation necessary. Society had largely forgotten her after the first year of mourning, having initially offered those half-hearted proposals from elderly widowers seeking convenient wives, and when she declined them all, the invitations had dwindled to near nothing. She became one of those women who existed on the margins of the social world, acknowledged with distant nods, never cut directly but never truly included, acceptable enough to lend respectability to numbers at a gathering, but not significant enough to merit genuine attention. The years had passed in a quiet blur of maternal devotion, of Caroline's childhood illnesses nursed through long nights, of grammar lessons and watercolor instruction. Eleanor provided herself, of carefully saved coins, eventually paying for a season that had blessedly resulted in Thomas Whitmore's honorable proposal. Now the ballroom swam back into focus before Eleanor's eyes, and she watched. Caroline dancing with her husband, the girl's face bright with the uncomplicated happiness of secure young love, and Eleanor felt the familiar ache of maternal satisfaction mingled with a loneliness she refused to name. She was 42 years old, a widow of 20 years, her youth spent, her purpose fulfilled, her remaining years stretching ahead in a landscape of increasing invisibility, until she would become one of those forgotten old women in rusty black whom no one quite remembered. She had made her peace with this future, or told herself she had, standing by her column in her grey silk gown while the music played and the candles flickered, and life continued for those who still had claim to it. The disturbance in the assembly room's careful social equilibrium occurred at 9:30, announced by a ripple of heightened attention that moved through the crowd like wind across a wheat field, and Eleanor noticed it from her peripheral position the way she noticed most things, as an observer, never expecting to be observed. The Duke of Tremaine had arrived, and even Eleanor, who paid little attention to society gossip, knew something of his story from the whispered conversations she had overheard during the past month. William Tremaine, 6th Duke of Tremaine, had returned to London after 15 years abroad, managing his family's extensive holdings in the West Indies and the Mediterranean, a self-imposed ex following the death of his young Duchess in childbed, and society had been alight with speculation about whether he would remarry now that he had finally come home. He was 48 years old, still handsome by all accounts, immensely wealthy, and in possession of one of the oldest titles in England, which made him the season's most sought-after prize, despite his age and his reputation for austere reserve. Eleanor watched him enter through the main doors, tall and broad-shouldered in his black evening clothes, his hair dark but silvered at the temples, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to command but wearied by its exercise. The crowd parted for him naturally, and the ambitious mothers positioned their daughters in his likely path with the precision of military tacticians, while the young ladies themselves deployed fans and curtsies and carefully practiced expressions of surprised delight at his presence. He moved through these social maneuvers with polite courtesy, but no apparent enthusiasm, accepting introductions with formal bows, speaking briefly with the host Lord Pemberton, his gaze sweeping the room with what seemed to Eleanor like the expression of a man performing a duty he found tiresome. She felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for him, this wealthy duke surrounded by admirers, because she recognized in his face something of her own careful mask, the expression one wore when participating in social rituals that had ceased to hold any genuine meaning. His survey of the room continued, passing over the clusters of debutantes and their chaperones, the groups of gentlemen discussing politics near the card-room entrance, the dancers forming sets for the next country dance, and then his gaze reached the eastern wall where Eleanor stood by her column in her grey silk. For a moment that could not have lasted more than 2 or 3 seconds, But that seemed to Eleanor to stretch much longer. His dark eyes met hers across the crowded ballroom, and she saw something shift in his expression, a subtle change she could not name, a focusing of attention that made her breath catch inexplicably in her chest. Then a matron in purple silk stepped into his line of sight with an introduction to her simpering daughter, and the moment broke. Eleanor exhaled and turned away, chiding herself for foolishness, for imagining significance in a glance that had probably not even registered her existence, for the dangerous habit of constructing meaning from nothing simply because one had been invisible so long that even the possibility of being seen created illusions. The evening had grown warm, despite the October chill outside, and the press of bodies in the assembly room made the air thick with mingled scents of perfume and candle wax and perspiration masked by lavender water. So when the terrace doors were opened for a refreshment interval, Eleanor made her way outside with relief she did not bother to conceal, since no one was observing her anyway. The garden beyond the terrace was lit with paper lanterns strung between the trees, their soft light kinder than the brilliant chandeliers inside, and Eleanor found a stone bench partially hidden by a trellis of late-blooming roses and sat down with a sigh that came from deeper than mere physical weariness. She had fulfilled her duty by attending, had been present for Caroline to see her mother supporting her new social position, and now she calculated that another 30 minutes would satisfy propriety before she could reasonably call for her carriage and retreat to the blessed solitude of her small townhouse. The sounds of music and laughter drifted from the open doors behind her, punctuated by the higher notes of feminine voices and the deeper rumble of masculine conversation, and Eleanor closed her eyes briefly against the familiar ache of being surrounded by life she no longer participated in, a ghost at the feast of society. When she opened her eyes again, the Duke of Tremaine was standing before her bench, and she startled so visibly that his expression shifted to concern. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the opposite end of the bench, and Eleanor found herself nodding before her rational mind could catalogue all the reasons why a duke would not actually wish to sit with her, and must be acting from some motive of polite obligation she could not fathom. He sat down with the unconscious grace of a man comfortable in his body, leaving a respectful distance between them, and for a moment neither spoke, while Eleanor's heart beat an uncomfortable rhythm against her ribs. "You looked thoughtful just now," he said finally, his voice a deep baritone that carried easily without rising in volume, "when your eyes were closed. I wondered what thoughts would create such an expression, something between weariness and resignation, but also perhaps relief." Eleanor stared at him, genuinely shocked not by his presence but by his words, by the fact that he had observed her closely enough to note an expression, that he spoke to her as though her thoughts might be interesting rather than offering the empty pleasantries about weather or music that comprised most social conversation. "I was thinking that I had stayed long enough to satisfy duty," she said after a pause, deciding that honesty was less dangerous than a tempting flirtation she had no skill for, and that I might soon escape to quieter surroundings. The Duke smiled, a small movement of his mouth that transformed his austere features into something warmer and unexpectedly appealing. "Then we are of similar mind," he replied, for I was calculating the same equation, wondering how soon I might leave without giving offence to Lord Pemberton, who has been kind enough to welcome me back to society. He turned slightly to face her more fully, and Eleanor saw in the lantern light that his eyes were dark grey, almost charcoal, with fine lines at the corners that suggested a man who had spent years squinting into sun, or perhaps smiling before grief taught him restraint. "Do you find these gatherings tiresome, Mrs. Ashworth, or am I alone in my curmudgeonly resistance to what I am assured are delightful entertainments?" Eleanor felt the shock of recognition that comes when a stranger articulates something one has felt privately for years, and she answered with a candour that surprised her, even as the words left her lips, telling him that she found these gatherings exhausting performances where everyone pretended enthusiasm for rituals that served only to display wealth and availability, where conversation was reduced to pleasantries that communicated nothing of substance, where she felt herself moving through prescribed steps like an actor in a play whose plot had long since ceased to interest her. William listened with an attention she could feel physically, his gaze steady on her face in a way that made her simultaneously self-conscious and strangely liberated. And when she finished speaking, he nodded slowly and said that he had thought himself alone in such observations, that everyone he had encountered since his return seemed genuinely delighted by society's offerings, while he felt only a hollow restlessness he could not shake. They spoke then with the easy flow of two people discovering unexpected common ground, their conversation ranging from the superficiality of social performance to the ways grief changed one's relationship with pleasure, and Eleanor found herself saying things she had never voiced aloud, observations about the cruelty of social hierarchies and the particular invisibility imposed on women past youth, while William spoke of his years abroad and the strange displacement of returning to find everything familiar yet alien, as though he had become a foreigner in his own country. He asked about her life with genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness, and Eleanor mentioned her daughter, Caroline, her pride in the young woman she had raised, her satisfaction in seeing Caroline happily settled. But when he gently probed about her own life beyond motherhood, Eleanor deflected with practiced ease, saying only that she was content with quiet pursuits and modest social obligations. She did not speak of her widowhood, because women of her age and station were not supposed to be anything other than widowed or married, were not supposed to have desires or ambitions beyond the care of others, and she would not burden this unexpected conversation with the weight of her resigned solitude. William seemed to sense the deflection, but did not press, instead shifting to speak of books he had read during his time abroad, and Eleanor felt herself relaxing into intellectual discussion about literature and philosophy, her mind engaging with ideas rather than social calculation for the first time in longer than she could remember. The conversation had perhaps lasted 15 minutes, though time seemed to have acquired a different quality in the lantern-lit garden, when a familiar voice cut through their exchange with the sharpness of breaking glass. "Mrs. Ashworth!" Lady Pemberton exclaimed with barely concealed shock, and something that might have been disapproval. "I did not expect to find you out here. And your Grace, surely you should be inside where the young ladies are so hoping to make your acquaintance after your long absence from society." The matron's round face was flushed with the importance of her mission, her eyes darting between Eleanor and William with an expression that communicated clearly her assessment of the situation, her belief that the Duke was wasting valuable time with an insignificant widow when eligible young women with fortunes and beauty awaited his attention inside. William rose with the smooth courtesy of a man accustomed to managing social situations, thanking Lady Pemberton for her concern and assuring her he would rejoin the company shortly, and though his words were perfectly polite, Eleanor heard beneath them a dismissal that the matron either did not perceive or chose to ignore as she continued to enumerate the many delights awaiting him inside, particularly the presence of Miss Hartwell, whose father owned considerable property in Derbyshire, and whose beauty was much remarked upon this season. Eleanor took the opportunity to stand and move away from the bench, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly as the enchantment of the past quarter hour dissolved under the cold assessment in Lady Pemberton's eyes, and she murmured something about returning inside herself before slipping past the matron and back through the terrace doors into the brilliant assault of candlelight and noise. She did not look back to see whether William followed Lady Pemberton inside or remained in the garden, told herself it did not matter, because the conversation had been merely a pleasant aberration, a moment out of time that would not and could not be repeated given the vast distance between a duke and a widow of no consequence. Eleanor made her way along the periphery of the ballroom toward the retiring room, her thoughts a jumble of pleasure at having been truly conversed with, and pain at the reminder of her insignificance. And as she passed a cluster of matrons near a marble pillar, she heard her name spoken in a tone of amused speculation. "I cannot imagine what the Duke was thinking," one woman said in a voice that carried despite its lowered volume, "spending so long in conversation with Eleanor Ashworth of all people. Perhaps he has been abroad so long he has forgotten how to identify suitable companions." Another voice, this one belonging to Mrs. Drummond, who had once been friendly before Eleanor's continued widowhood became an embarrassment, replied that perhaps the Duke was simply being kind to a pathetic figure, for surely no man of his station could have any genuine interest in a woman so thoroughly past her prime. Her looks quite faded, and her circumstances so modest she could barely be called gentry. The words landed like physical blows despite Eleanor having heard similar assessments countless times before, and she continued walking with her spine straight and her face composed in the expression of dignified neutrality she had perfected over 20 years of social diminishment. She reached the retiring room and sat before the mirror, seeing reflected back the truth of their words in the silver threads at her temples, the lines bracketing her mouth, the softness of her jaw that had once been firm, the body that had thickened through middle age despite her modest appetite. This was who she was, a woman of 42 whose youth and whatever small beauty she had possessed were long gone, and the fact that a duke had spoken with her kindly changed nothing about that reality. Eleanor repaired her composure, tucked an errant strand of hair back into place, and made her decision to leave immediately, rather than endure another hour of being invisible, or worse, being visible only as an object of puzzled contempt, and she made her way toward the entrance hall to request her carriage, ready to retreat to the safety of insignificance. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall waiting for her carriage to be brought around, her shawl drawn tight against the chill that seemed to emanate from within rather than from the October night air, and she occupied herself by studying the marble floor tiles rather than risking eye contact with the other guests who periodically passed through on their way to or from the ballroom, their laughter and chatter emphasizing her solitude and her decision to retreat from a world that had no place for her. The footman had informed her there would be a delay of perhaps 10 minutes, as her modest hired conveyance had been sent around to the mews to make room for the carriages of more important guests, and Eleanor accepted this small indignity with the same practiced grace with which she accepted all the accumulated slights of her position, telling herself she was foolish to have allowed a single conversation to penetrate the protective resignation she had cultivated so carefully over 20 years. She heard footsteps approaching with purposeful speed and looked up to see William Tremaine striding across the marble floor toward her, his expression intent in a way that made her heart contract with something between hope and alarm, and she glanced behind her to see whom he might be pursuing before realizing with absolute bewilderment that his attention was fixed on her alone. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said as he reached her, slightly breathless as though he had been searching. "I had hoped to find you before you departed. May I have a moment of your time?" Eleanor nodded mutely, unable to imagine what would bring a duke to pursue her to the entrance hall, and William glanced at the footman standing discreetly near the door before gesturing toward a small alcove that offered the illusion of privacy while maintaining perfect propriety. He waited until she had moved into the alcove before speaking again, his voice low but clear as he said that he had found their conversation in the garden the most genuine exchange he had experienced since returning to England, and he would very much like to continue their acquaintance if she would permit it. Eleanor stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or misplaced pity, finding neither but still unable to comprehend his meaning, and she said carefully that she had also enjoyed their conversation, and if he wished to call upon her daughter Caroline, she would, of course, be honored to receive him. William smiled then, a small expression that transformed his serious features into something warmer, and he said with gentle clarity that while he was certain Miss Caroline was delightful, it was Eleanor herself upon whom he wished to call, if she would grant him permission to do so. The words seemed to rearrange themselves in Eleanor's mind as she tried to make sense of them. A duke asking permission to call on a 42-year-old widow of no consequence, and she felt heat rise in her face as she stammered that she lived very quietly in a modest establishment in Bloomsbury and could not imagine why he would wish to visit, her words trailing off as she realized she was essentially arguing against her own desirability. William's expression remained patient, and something else she could not quite identify, something that looked almost like tenderness, as he said simply that he wished to know her better, to continue the conversation they had begun, and would she give him her direction? Eleanor heard herself reciting her address as though from a great distance, her voice sounding strange in her own ears, and William repeated it back to confirm, before saying he would call upon her in 2 or 3 days if that would be acceptable. She nodded, still bewildered, and he reached for her hand with a deliberateness that gave her every opportunity to withdraw, lifting it gently and bowing over it in a gesture that would have been merely formal except for the warmth of his fingers through her glove and the way his thumb brushed across her knuckles in a touch so brief she might have imagined it except for the way her skin seemed to remember sensation it had not felt in 20 years. He released her hand and stepped back with a small bow before striding back toward the ballroom, leaving Eleanor standing in the alcove with her hand still raised slightly as though she could preserve the ghost of his touch. And when the footman appeared to announce her carriage, she moved toward the door in a daze that accompanied her through the short journey home and followed her into restless dreams where she could not tell whether she was being offered hope or being prepared for a more elaborate disappointment than any she had yet endured. 3 days passed in a state of suspended unreality, during which Eleanor alternately convinced herself that the Duke of Tremaine would not actually appear at her door, and that if he did, it would be to politely withdraw his impulsive offer, and she occupied herself with household tasks and reading, while Caroline watched her with barely suppressed excitement that Eleanor could not bring herself to share, knowing that hope was a dangerous indulgence that had brought her nothing but pain in the past. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Eleanor was sitting in her small drawing room, attempting to focus on needlework, when her housekeeper Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled astonishment, to announce that the Duke of Tremaine had called and was waiting in the entrance hall, and Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly as she set down her work with hands that trembled and smoothed her simple day dress of grey merino wool that suddenly seemed impossibly plain before telling Mrs. Davies to show him in. She stood as William entered the modest drawing-room with its faded upholstery and simple furnishings that looked even more humble in the presence of a man who owned 3 estates and a London mansion. But if he noticed the worn carpet or the mended curtains, his expression gave no indication as he bowed and thanked her for receiving him, and Eleanor noticed he carried a slim volume bound in leather that he placed on the side table as Mrs. Davies withdrew after a significant glance that promised the housekeeper would be hovering within earshot to preserve propriety. Caroline appeared in the doorway within moments, her eyes wide with curiosity and delight, and William greeted her with perfect courtesy before turning back to Eleanor and saying that he had brought the volume of Wordsworth they had discussed during their conversation, a first edition he thought she might enjoy, and Eleanor felt something catch in her chest at the realization that he had not only remembered their brief exchange about poetry, but had gone to the trouble of bringing a gift that spoke to that specific conversation. Caroline offered tea, and Eleanor nodded gratefully, needing something to occupy her hands and attention while she tried to manage the surreal experience of having a duke sitting in her drawing room on a worn settee that had been old when her husband died, and as Caroline supervised the tea service, William spoke easily about the weather and inquired after their comfort with a naturalness that seemed designed to put Eleanor at ease, though her heart continued to race beneath her carefully composed exterior. When the tea had been poured and distributed, William turned to Caroline with a smile and said that he had greatly enjoyed meeting her, but wondered if he might impose upon her kindness by requesting a few moments of private conversation with her mother, the question phrased so courteously that Caroline could do nothing but agree, though her expression as she left the room combined amazement with unmistakable pleasure that her mother was the object of such particular attention. The door closed behind Caroline, and Eleanor found herself alone with William. in a silence that felt charged with possibility and danger, and when she dared to meet his eyes, she found him watching her with an expression of such focused attention that she felt seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, as though he could perceive not just her physical presence, but the thoughts and fears and half-acknowledged hopes that she had kept buried for 20 years beneath the protective armor of resignation. William leaned forward slightly in his seat, his teacup balanced in long fingers that looked accustomed to holding far more substantial things than delicate porcelain, and he said with quiet directness that he hoped she would tell him something of herself, of her life these past years, if she felt comfortable doing so. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the intimacy of the request, at being asked to speak of herself as though her experiences held value worth knowing, and she found herself speaking haltingly at first about her years of widowhood, about raising Caroline alone on the modest income left by her husband's small estate, about the quiet satisfactions of watching her daughter grow into a woman of character and kindness. William listened with an attention so complete that Eleanor felt each word she spoke being received and considered rather than merely heard. And when she faltered, he asked gentle questions that drew out details she had never shared with anyone, about the loneliness of those early years and the slow resignation that had replaced the grief, about learning to find purpose in duty when hope seemed an indulgence she could not afford. She stopped abruptly, horrified that she had revealed so much, but William's expression held no pity, only a recognition that made her feel understood in a way she had not experienced since her husband's death, and he said quietly that he knew something of that particular loneliness, that particular reshaping of oneself around absence. He told her then about his own wife, about a marriage contracted young between two people who held genuine affection for each other, but had not yet learned what love might become given time, and about her death in childbed, along with the son who might have been their shared future. He had thrown himself into managing the family estates, he said, taking on the overseas properties that needed attention and spending 15 years in service to duty and responsibility. And when he finally returned to England earlier this year, he found himself moving through a society that felt insubstantial, full of people who seemed to be performing rather than living. He paused and set down his teacup with careful precision before continuing, his eyes holding hers as he said that when he entered the assembly 3 nights ago he had been preparing himself for another evening of empty pleasantries and meaningless exchanges, but then he had seen her face across the room, and something in her expression, a quality of genuine feeling and thought, had arrested his attention completely. He said he had watched her standing at the periphery observing the dancers, and had seen in the set of her shoulders and the slight sadness of her smile a person who had truly lived, who had experienced loss and persevered, who possessed depths that the glittering young misses fluttering their fans could not begin to match. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and looked down at her own teacup to hide them, overwhelmed by hearing herself described as someone worth noticing rather than someone who had faded into irrelevance. And William's voice gentled further as he said he had sought her out in the garden precisely because he wanted to know the person behind that expressive face. And everything she had said in their brief conversation had confirmed his initial impression that here was someone rare and valuable, someone he very much wanted to know better. The calls became regular with a pattern that Eleanor found both exhilarating and terrifying, William appearing at her door 2 or sometimes 3 times each week with books to discuss or invitations to take tea or simple desire for conversation. And with each visit, Eleanor felt the careful walls she had constructed around her heart, developing fissures even as she told herself not to read too much into his attention or assume intentions he might not hold. The gossip that had begun as curious whispers at the assembly intensified into something more pointed and cruel, reaching Eleanor's ears through Caroline, who heard it at social gatherings and through the barely concealed speculation of tradespeople and even Eleanor's own housekeeper, who reported with scandalized delight that the neighbors were all talking about the Duke's regular visits to their modest street. Eleanor overheard two women at the draper's shop where she was selecting ribbon-speak in voices just loud enough to ensure she would hear about how the Duke of Tremaine must have taken leave of his sense, to waste his time on a woman past 40 with no fortune and faded looks. And one suggested with malicious certainty that Mrs. Ashworth must be more cunning than she appeared to have ensnared such distinguished attention. Caroline defended her mother with fierce loyalty whenever such comments reached her directly, and her husband supported her efforts, but Eleanor knew that her daughter's social position could be damaged by association as with a mother who was becoming the subject of ridicule, and this knowledge added weight to her growing internal turmoil about what exactly William intended by his continued attention. She found herself caught between wild hope that his visits meant what her heart desperately wanted them to mean, and the more familiar voice of resignation that insisted a duke could not possibly be courting a woman like her, that he must simply be lonely after his years abroad and seeking intellectual companionship without romantic intent, that she was a fool to imagine herself as anything other than a temporary diversion before he turned his attention to the young, eligible women who would make appropriate duchesses. At night, Eleanor lay awake, analyzing every word of their conversations and every expression that had crossed William's face, searching for evidence that would settle the question one way or another, but finding only ambiguity that left her suspended in uncertainty. During his visits, William seemed utterly unconcerned with the growing scandal, speaking to her with the same focused attention and genuine interest that had characterized their first conversation, asking her opinions on matters of philosophy and literature and estate management, with a respect that suggested he valued her thoughts, but he had not spoken directly of his intentions, or given her any clear indication of whether his feelings extended beyond friendship. Eleanor found herself unable to ask, terrified that voicing the question would shatter whatever this fragile thing between them was, and force a clarification that might reveal her hopes as delusions. And so she remained in a state of suspended waiting, while London society watched and whispered and formed judgments about the aging widow who had somehow captured the attention of one of England's most eligible peers. William arrived at her townhouse on a bright October morning when the air carried a crispness that promised the full arrival of autumn, and he asked with careful formality if she would do him the honor of accompanying him for a walk in Hyde Park, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anxiety at the prospect of appearing in public at his side, where all of London society took its daily exercise and observation. She hesitated long enough that William noticed, his expression growing concerned as he asked if the invitation made her uncomfortable, and Eleanor found she could not dissemble or pretend indifference when his eyes held such genuine care, so she admitted quietly that she would be honored to walk with him, but that she feared the attention such an appearance would draw. William's jaw tightened slightly, and he said with quiet firmness that he would not subject her to anything she did not wish to endure, but that he hoped she might trust him to stand beside her against whatever foolish opinions others might hold, and there was something in his steady gaze that made Eleanor find her courage and accept. The park was beautiful in the late morning light, the trees beginning their transformation into gold and crimson, and as they walked along the Serpentine, with Eleanor's hand resting lightly on William's arm, she found their conversation flowing as easily as it did in her drawing-room, ranging from a book of philosophy he had lent her to questions about managing tenant relations on his northern estates to her observations about the changing character of London society. For long stretches Eleanor could almost forget they were being watched, could lose herself in the pleasure of William's company and the simple physical reality of walking beside him, feeling the solid strength of his arm beneath her gloved hand and matching her steps to his longer stride. But the illusion of privacy could not be maintained against the reality of stares that followed their progress and the whispers that rose in their wake like wind through dry leaves. Eleanor saw women she had known for years, women who had once included her in their circles when she was a young wife, before widowhood had rendered her invisible, and she watched their faces register shock and calculation, and in some cases barely concealed malice, as they observed her walking with the Duke. When Mrs. Hartwell approached on the path, a woman who had been Eleanor's closest friend in those early years of her marriage, Eleanor felt a flutter of hope that perhaps one person at least would greet her kindly. But Mrs. Hartwell's eyes passed over Eleanor as though she were not present, before fixing on William with an ingratiating smile. And when Eleanor softly spoke her former friend's name, Mrs. Hartwell turned deliberately away and continued walking, the cut so direct and public that Eleanor felt heat rise in her face. William had gone very still beside her, and when Eleanor glanced up at his profile, she saw his expression had hardened into something cold and remote, though when he looked down at her, his eyes softened immediately, and he asked in a low voice if she wished to leave. Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to give the watching crowds the satisfaction of seeing her retreat, and William's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm, a gesture of solidarity and protection that steadied her even as she felt the weight of 100 gazes marking every detail of the moment for later dissection and judgment. They completed their circuit of the park in silence that felt both protective and profound, William's hand remaining over hers on his arm. And when he handed her into her carriage outside her townhouse, he asked in a low voice if he might call upon her that evening, rather than waiting for their usual pattern. And Eleanor nodded mutely, still shaken by the public humiliation she had endured. He arrived as twilight was settling over London, the lamplighters making their rounds and casting pools of golden light along the street, and when Eleanor received him in her drawing-room, she saw that the cold hardness she had glimpsed in the park had not entirely left his features. William waited until they were seated before speaking, and then he asked with careful deliberation whether his attentions were unwelcome to her, whether she wished him to cease his visits. And the question struck Eleanor with such unexpected force that she felt tears prick her eyes, even as she shook her head in denial. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen in equal measure, and he said that he needed her to understand that what had occurred in the park would likely happen again, that society's judgment could be cruel, and that he would not subject her to such treatment if she did not wish it, but that his own feelings were such that he could not simply walk away without knowing her true mind. Eleanor found her voice trembling as she admitted that she did not understand his attentions, could not comprehend why a man of his position and prospects would choose to spend his time with a woman so far past her youth and possessed of neither fortune nor beauty nor any of the qualities that should recommend her to a duke's notice. William grew very still as she spoke, and when she fell silent, he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her with a grace that seemed incongruous for a man of his size and station, bringing his eyes level with hers. He said in a voice rough with feeling that he saw her dignity in how she carried herself through rooms that tried to render her invisible, saw her intelligence in every conversation they shared, saw in her expressive face the evidence of a life truly lived, with all its joys and sorrows, rather than the blank perfection of youth that knew nothing of sacrifice or strength. He told her that when he looked at her, he saw a woman who had raised a daughter alone and done it well, who had survived loss and limitation with grace, who had not grown bitter despite having every reason to do so, and that these qualities were worth more than any dowry or any smooth skin unmarked by time. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as he spoke, unable to reconcile this vision of herself with the woman she saw in her mirror each morning. And when William reached up slowly to brush away her tears with his thumb, she felt the touch like a brand against her skin. He asked again whether his attentions were unwelcome, and she whispered that they were not, that they were the most welcome thing she had experienced in 20 years, and she watched something like relief and triumph cross his features before he composed himself and returned to his chair, though the air between them felt fundamentally changed, charged with possibility and promise that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The invitation arrived 3 days after their conversation in her drawing-room, delivered by a liveried footman who waited while Eleanor read the heavy cream paper with its elegant script. and her hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the request that she join the Duke of Tremaine for a private dinner at his London residence, with the assurance that his sister Lady Margaret would be present to observe all proprieties. Eleanor's first instinct was to decline, to retreat to the safety of her modest home and the familiar boundaries of afternoon calls in her own drawing room, but something in William's words during their last meeting had lodged in her heart like a seed that insisted on taking root, despite all her efforts to maintain the barren ground of resignation. She sent her acceptance back with the footman, and then spent 2 days in anxious preparation, consulting with Caroline about what she should wear and whether accepting such an invitation would be seen as forward. And her daughter had embraced her with fierce joy and declared that Eleanor deserved every happiness and that the Duke was clearly a man of discernment. The evening arrived cold and clear, the first week of November bringing a bite to the air that hinted at winter's approach. And as Eleanor's modest hired carriage drew up before William's townhouse in Grosvenor Square, she felt her courage nearly desert her at the sight of the magnificent facade, with its columns and perfectly proportioned windows blazing with light. A butler received her with a deference she was unaccustomed to, taking her cloak with the same careful attention he would give a duchess, and she was led through halls hung with paintings and furnished with pieces that spoke of generations of wealth and taste, until she reached a drawing-room where William stood beside the fire with a woman who could only be his sister. Lady Margaret Fairfax was perhaps 3 years younger than William, with the same grey eyes and a warmth in her expression that immediately eased some of Eleanor's nervousness, and when William made the introductions, Margaret took Eleanor's hands in both of hers and said with genuine feeling that she was delighted to finally meet the woman who had brought her brother back to life. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at such a direct statement, but Margaret's smile held no mockery or calculation, only a frank kindness that made Eleanor understand where William had learned his own directness. The dinner itself was served in an intimate dining room, rather than the grand formal space Eleanor had feared. The table set for just the 3 of them, with flowers and candlelight that created an atmosphere of warmth rather than intimidation, and Margaret proved to be an engaging conversationalist, who drew Eleanor out on topics ranging from literature to the challenges of managing a household on limited means. William watched Eleanor throughout the meal with an expression of quiet contentment, contributing to the conversation but seeming equally satisfied to simply observe her, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into the evening in a way she had not anticipated, the wine and good food and genuine companionship loosening the tight knot of anxiety that had resided in her chest. After dinner, Margaret suggested they take coffee in the drawing-room, and as they rose from the table, she touched Eleanor's arm and asked if she might speak with her privately for just a moment, and William nodded his permission before leaving the 2 women alone. Margaret led Eleanor to a quieter corner of the drawing-room where the firelight cast dancing shadows across the silk wallpaper, and she turned to face the older woman with an expression of such earnest warmth that Eleanor felt her remaining defences begin to crumble. Lady Margaret said softly that she hoped Eleanor would forgive the presumption of what she was about to say, but that she felt compelled to speak plainly because she had observed something in the past weeks that filled her with both joy and concern. She told Eleanor that William had been merely existing rather than living since his return to England, going through the motions of his duties with efficiency, but no spark of genuine engagement, attending social events with the same enthusiasm one might bring to reviewing account ledgers, and that she had watched her brother slowly disappearing into a kind of waking sleep where nothing seemed to touch him deeply. But then something had changed, Margaret continued, her eyes bright with feeling. And when she had asked William about the sudden transformation he had spoken of meeting a woman at an assembly, a woman whose face had arrested him because it showed evidence of gentianat thought and feeling rather than the carefully constructed blankness that passed for beauty in society. Margaret said she had not seen her brother truly alive in years until these past weeks, had not heard him laugh with genuine amusement or speak with animated interest about anything beyond crop rotations and estate improvements, and that whatever Eleanor had done or been, it had awakened something in William that Margaret had feared was lost forever. Eleanor felt tears threatening again as she listened, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that what she had begun to feel was not simply her own desperate imagination, but something real and reciprocated, and Margaret reached out to squeeze her hand before saying gently that she simply wanted Eleanor to know that William's family, or at least this member of it, welcomed her presence in his life with profound gratitude. The two women returned to the drawing room where William waited, and Eleanor saw his eyes search her face with concern, until Margaret smiled at him with a warmth that seemed to communicate reassurance. And then Margaret declared that she was suddenly quite fatigued and would retire early, leaving them with the proprieties barely maintained, but the spirit of chaperonage honored. William offered to show Eleanor a painting in his gallery that he thought might interest her, and she accepted, following him through the quiet house to a long room lined with artwork collected over generations. He stopped before a landscape of the Italian countryside, all golden light and ancient olive trees, and as Eleanor studied the brushwork and composition, she became aware that William had moved to stand just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and catch the scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. They stood in silence for a long moment, and then Eleanor felt rather than saw his hand rise slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and his fingers touched a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins, the silver catching the candlelight from the sconces along the wall. He said in a voice low and rough with feeling that it was beautiful, like moonlight made tangible, and Eleanor froze completely, every nerve in her body focused on that single point of contact where his fingers held her hair. Eleanor had believed herself prepared for social cruelty after 20 years of navigating society's margins, but nothing could have fortified her against the confrontation that occurred at Lady Pemberton's musicale 4 days after the evening at William's townhouse. She had attended only because Caroline insisted, and she stood near the refreshment table during the interval between performances, her cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she observed the glittering assembly and tried not to think too often of how William's fingers had felt against her hair, or the way his voice had roughened when he called it beautiful. She noticed a young man approaching with purposeful strides, his expression set in lines of barely contained anger, and she recognized him from gossip as Lord Edmund Tremaine, William's nephew and heir presumptive to the dukedom. A man of perhaps 28, with his uncle's grey eyes, but none of his warmth. Edmund stopped directly before her with a lack of courtesy that immediately drew attention from nearby guests, and he said in a voice pitched to carry that he wished to speak with Mrs. Ashworth about a matter of family concern. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with dread, but she maintained her composure and inclined her head, waiting for the blow she sensed coming, and Edmund wasted no time in delivering it with the precision of a blade designed to wound. He said that he felt it his duty to inform her that the Duke of Tremaine was a man of considerable fortune whose affections had been sought by many families of distinction, and that he found it remarkable that a woman of her age and circumstances should suddenly attract such marked attention from his uncle. The words hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor heard the gasps and whispers rippling outward from their position as other guests absorbed the implication. The direct accusation of fortune hunting delivered with a veneer of civilized concern. She felt heat flood her face, but she kept her voice steady as she replied that the Duke's friendship had been entirely unsolicited on her part, and that she had given Lord Edmund no cause to question her integrity. Edmund's smile was cold as he continued, saying that perhaps she was unaware that William had been in a vulnerable state since his return to England, that grief and isolation could make even sensible men susceptible to manipulation by those who recognized an opportunity. Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow, not because she believed them, but because she knew how they would sound to the assembled company, how they would feed into every whispered suspicion about her modest circumstances and faded looks. She was gathering herself to respond with what dignity she could muster, when a voice cut through the tension like winter wind, cold and sharp, with an authority that silenced the room. William stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered, and Eleanor had never seen his face so transformed by anger. The usual warmth in his grey eyes replaced by something that made Edmund take an involuntary step backward. William crossed the space between them with measured steps and positioned himself beside Eleanor, not touching her, but close enough that his solidarity was unmistakable, and he addressed his nephew in tones that carried to every corner of the room. He said that Lord Edmund had overstepped every boundary of courtesy and family respect, that William's friendships and intentions were his own affair and required neither Edmund's approval nor his protection, and that if Edmund valued his position in the family, he would offer Mrs. Ashworth an immediate apology and then remove himself from William's presence until he learned better manners. Edmund stood frozen for a long moment, his face flushing dark red, as he recognized that his uncle had just publicly humiliated him in precisely the manner he had attempted to humiliate Eleanor, and he managed a stiff bow and something that might have been an apology before retreating through the crowd that parted to let him pass. William remained at Eleanor's side as the whispers swelled around them, and he offered her his arm with such calm dignity that she took it automatically, allowing him to escort her through the musical audience and out into the entrance hall, where the cool air provided relief from the suffocating atmosphere of scandal and speculation. They stood in silence for a moment before Eleanor gently extracted her arm from his and said in a voice she struggled to keep steady that she was grateful for his defense, but that they both knew his nephew had simply articulated what much of society was thinking, and that she could not bear to be the cause of such conflict within his family or such damage to his reputation. William turned to face her fully, and she saw that the anger had faded from his expression, replaced by something that looked like pain, and he said quietly that if she wished to end their acquaintance, she had that right, but that she must do so because she truly desired it, and not because she was trying to protect him from consequences he was fully prepared to accept. Eleanor felt tears threatening, and she blinked them back fiercely because she would not add public weeping to the evening's humiliations, and she told him that what she desired was irrelevant when measured against the cost to him, the family discord and social ridicule that would only intensify if their friendship continued. William took a step closer, and his voice dropped to a tone meant only for her as he asked whether her feelings were engaged, whether she felt for him anything beyond mere friendship. Because if this was simply a pleasant acquaintance for her, then he would accept her withdrawal. But if her feelings went deeper, then he needed to know before she made any decisions. Eleanor looked up into his grey eyes and found she could not lie, could not pretend indifference when her heart was racing and her hands were trembling and every part of her was crying out against the thought of never seeing him again, and she whispered that, yes, her feelings were engaged, that somewhere in the past weeks she had begun to feel things she thought herself too old and too sensible to ever feel again. William's expression transformed with relief and something fiercer, and he said with quiet intensity that his feelings were equally engaged, that he had not spent these weeks simply seeking pleasant companionship, but rather pursuing a woman who had captured both his attention and his heart, and that if she felt the same, then they would face the gossip and the family complications together, rather than surrendering to them. Eleanor shook her head and said he did not understand the depth of opposition he would face, that his nephew represented only the beginning of what would become a sustained campaign to separate them, and that she had lived too long on society's margins not to know how vicious and relentless such campaigns could become. William replied that perhaps she did not understand that he had spent 15 years abroad managing complex political situations and navigating genuine dangers, and that he was not a man easily deterred by whispers and disapproval, especially not when what he wanted was standing before him trying to sacrifice her own happiness for his supposed benefit. Their first real argument unfolded there in the entrance hall, voices rising slightly as Eleanor insisted he was underestimating the cost, and William countered that she was underestimating his determination and commitment. The argument dissolved into something quieter and more vulnerable when William suggested they move to a small sitting room that Lady Pemberton kept for guests seeking privacy, and there, in that space lit by a single lamp, he guided Eleanor to a settee and took the seat beside her, rather than maintaining the formal distance that propriety demanded. He was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor saw him gathering himself for something difficult. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that made her turn to face him fully. He told her about his late wife, Catherine, a marriage arranged between their families when he was 25 and she was 19, a union born of duty and expectation rather than passionate attachment, though they had developed genuine affection over their 3 years together. Catherine had been beautiful in the way society valued, golden-haired and delicate-featured, accomplished at all the arts expected of a duchess. And William had been fond of her, and she of him, in that comfortable way of two people fulfilling the roles assigned to them. She had died delivering their stillborn son, both lives lost in a single terrible night. And William had retreated into grief, and then into duty, accepting a diplomatic posting abroad that kept him away from England and its memories for 15 years. He described returning to London society and finding it earthly as he had left it, the same shallow conversations and calculated maneuvers and endless positioning for advantage, and how he had felt like a ghost moving through a world that no longer held meaning for him. Then he had seen Eleanor across Lady Harrington's ballroom 2 months ago, and something in her face had arrested him completely, a quality of thoughtful presence that suggested an actual person resided behind the eyes, rather than simply a performer of social rituals. William turned to look directly at Eleanor as he continued, his grey eyes intent and serious, and he told her that what he saw when he looked at her were the evidences of a life truly lived rather than merely performed. He saw the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and knew they came from years of smiling at her daughter, from squinting over books read late into the night, from all the small joys and sorrows that marked a woman who had felt things deeply. He saw the silver threading through her dark hair and thought it beautiful because it spoke of time past and wisdom earned. He saw the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her modest dress and peripheral position in society, and he recognized in that dignity a strength of character that had nothing to do with wealth or status. He told her that his marriage to Catherine had been pleasant but not transformative, that he had cared for her but never felt this sense of being truly known by another person, and that perhaps he needed these years of life and loss behind him to be capable of recognizing and valuing what he saw in Eleanor. His voice roughened slightly as he admitted that he had thought himself content with memory and duty until he looked across a ballroom and saw a woman whose face showed evidence of courage and resilience and depth, and that in the weeks since he had come to need her presence the way he needed air and light. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks and did not try to stop them, and William reached up slowly to catch one on his fingertip. Eleanor's own vulnerability rose in response to his, and she found herself speaking truths she had barely allowed herself to think in the 20 years since her husband's death. She told William that she had been 19 when she married Thomas Ashworth, a man of 52 who had wanted a young wife to brighten his final years, and that their 3 years together had been marked by kindness and companionship, though not the passionate attachment of fairy tales. When Thomas died, she had been 22 years old with an infant daughter and barely enough income to maintain a modest household, and society had made clear that her value had ended with her husband's life. She described the slow process of becoming invisible, how at first there had been sympathetic attention as a young pretty widow, but as the years passed and the prettiness faded and no remarriage materialized, she had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the social world. She told him about devoting herself entirely to Caroline, finding purpose in raising her daughter to be strong and kind and capable, and how she had genuinely believed herself content with that limited sphere until he had looked at her across a ballroom and made her feel like a woman again, rather than simply a mother and a relic. Her voice broke slightly as she admitted that she looked in her mirror each morning and saw every line and every grey hair and every year of her 42, and that she could not fathom why a man like him would look at her and see anything worthy of desire or commitment. William listened with complete attention, and when she fell silent, he took both her hands in his, and his touch was warm and steady and utterly grounding. He told her he wanted to describe what he saw when he looked at her, and he began a catalogue delivered in that quiet, intense voice that made her feel as though they were the only two people in existence. He spoke of her eyes, dark brown and expressive, with those lines at the corners that came from smiling and from sorrow both, lines that showed she had lived a life of genuine feeling rather than maintaining the smooth, blank perfection of someone who had never risked caring deeply. He described her hands, capable and graceful, hands that had held a baby and managed a household and turned pages of books late into the night, hands that showed their history in every small mark and told him she was a woman who did things rather than simply existing ornamentally. He spoke of the way she held herself, the quiet dignity in her posture that never wavered whether she was entering a ballroom or facing his nephew's cruelty, a strength of character that he found infinitely more beautiful than any arrangement of features. William reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather portfolio, and when he opened it, Eleanor gasped because it contained sketches of her, a dozen or more, drawn from memory in the hours when he was apart from her. There she was in profile as she had looked in his gallery examining paintings. There she was laughing at something he had said during their park walk. There she was in thoughtful repose as she had appeared while listening to music at Lady Pemberton's musicale. The sketches were skillfully done and captured not just her appearance, but something of her inner self, and seeing herself through his eyes in these drawings made Eleanor understand for the first time that he truly did see her as beautiful, that this was not kindness or delusion, but genuine perception. She looked up from the sketches to find him watching her face with an expression of such tender vulnerability that she felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of herself and what might be possible in the years ahead. The fragile hope that had been building in Eleanor over the past weeks shattered completely when she walked past Ackerman's print shop on Bond Street. 4 days after the evening at Lady Pemberton's, and saw the cartoon displayed prominently in the window among the other satirical prints that Londoners purchased for entertainment. She had been on her way to the modiste with Caroline, feeling almost light-hearted for the first time in years, but the image stopped her as surely as a physical blow, and she stood frozen on the pavement while other pedestrians moved around her with irritated murmurs. The cartoon depicted a wizened crone in an outmoded gown clutching the arm of a distinguished gentleman whose coronet marked him clearly as a duke, and the caption read, "The autumn of his reason," in letters large enough to be seen from across the street. The artist had exaggerated every feature that Eleanor saw in her mirror each morning, and feared the world saw when they looked at her, transforming the lines of her face into grotesque crevices, and her silver-streaked hair into a wild grey tangle, and the figure's grasping posture suggested avarice and manipulation rather than any genuine feeling. Caroline gasped beside her and tried to pull her mother away, but Eleanor could not move, could only stare at this vicious rendering of herself and William, and feel the weight of public mockery crushing the tender new growth of her self-worth. The Duke in the cartoon wore an expression of befuddled dotage that transformed William's dignified maturity into senility, the clear implication being that only a man who had lost his faculties would attach himself to such a creature as the cartoon depicted. Eleanor was aware of people stopping to look at the print, aware of the laughter and pointed comments, aware that some of those gathering recognized her standing there, and the laughter grew more pointed and more cruel. She finally allowed Caroline to lead her away, moving through the streets in a fog of humiliation so profound that she barely registered where they were going until she found herself back in her own drawing room with Caroline kneeling beside her chair and holding her hands. The days that followed were a return to the grey, isolated existence Eleanor had known before William entered her life, except now the greyness was darker because she had glimpsed what might have been possible and understood exactly what she was losing. She refused to see William when he called the next day, and the day after that, sending word through her maid that she was indisposed, and she burned the notes he sent without reading them because she could not bear the kindness she knew they would contain. Caroline argued and pleaded, but Eleanor remained adamant, and in the quiet hours alone she worked to rebuild the walls of protective resignation that William had so carefully dismantled. She told herself she had been foolish to imagine that a duke could genuinely care for a woman of 42 with a lined face and modest circumstances, that his attention had been a temporary aberration born of loneliness and novelty, and that the cartoon had simply made public what everyone already knew to be true. By the end of the week, she had composed a letter that cost her more pain than anything she had written in her life. Formal words expressing gratitude for his friendship, but clearly and definitively ending any further connection between them, and she sealed it with hands that shook and sent it by messenger before she could change her mind. The letter had been gone less than an hour when Eleanor heard the commotion at her front door, the sound of a familiar voice speaking with quiet intensity to her maid, and then footsteps taking the stairs with more speed than propriety generally allowed, and William was in her drawing room before she could even rise from her chair. He held her letter in one hand, the seal broken, and his face showed an expression she had never seen before, something between determination and desperation that made her heart clench, even as she opened her mouth to repeat the sentiments she had labored so painfully to compose. He spoke before she could, his voice rough with feeling, and asked her a single question that cut through all her careful reasoning and protective walls. "Do you love me?" It was not phrased as a question despite the rising inflection, and Eleanor found she could not lie to him even now when a lie might save them both from further pain. She said yes in a voice barely above a whisper, and watched something shift in his expression. The desperation easing through the determination remained as strong as ever. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his despite her faint protest, and he asked another question in that same direct manner that demanded truth. "Do you want a life with me, Eleanor? Truly want it? Not what society approves or what you think is best for me, but what you yourself desire?" She felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks, because the answer to that question was so much more complicated than a simple yes or no, and she tried to explain that what she wanted did not matter when balanced against the cost to him, the ridicule and the family strife, and the damage to his position that would come from binding himself to a woman society had deemed unworthy. William listened until she fell silent, and then he said something that made her breath catch, his voice steady and certain, and filled with a conviction that allowed no argument. He told her that she was the only thing that mattered, that he had lived 48 years and buried a wife and spent 15 of those years in exile managing distant estates and performing duty with meticulous care, and that in all that time he had never felt as alive as he did in her presence. He said he had earned the right to choose his own happiness, and he was choosing her, and that if she would not accept his devotion for her own sake, then perhaps she might accept it because denying him would cause him greater pain than any amount of social mockery ever could. Eleanor looked down at him, kneeling beside her chair, this distinguished man who commanded respect wherever he went, and she saw in his face such genuine feeling that her carefully constructed arguments began to crumble. William reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a small velvet box, and when he opened it, she saw a ring that glowed warmly in the afternoon light streaming through her modest windows, a band of gold set with a ruby surrounded by small diamonds, beautiful but not ostentatious, chosen with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything concerning her. He held it up between them and told her he was going to ask her a question, and this time he wanted an answer that came from her heart rather than from her fears. And then he asked her in formal words, weighted with emotion, if she would do him the very great honor of becoming his wife. Eleanor stared at the ring glowing between them and felt the full weight of the moment settle over her like a physical presence. This instant when her entire future hung suspended between the terror of vulnerability and the intoxicating possibility of genuine happiness. William remained kneeling beside her chair with a patience that suggested he would stay there for hours if necessary, and in his face she saw such complete certainty that it made her own doubts feel almost childish. Yet the doubts were real and born of 20 years of learning to protect herself from hope. She thought of the cartoon in the print shop window, thought of his nephew's accusations, thought of every whispered comment she had endured throughout the weeks of their courtship. But then she looked at William's hands holding that ring and remembered how those same hands had touched her hair with such reverence in his gallery, how his fingers had traced the lines of her palm as though reading something precious written there. He had asked her to marry him, to become his wife and duchess, to step fully into the visibility she had spent 2 decades avoiding, and the enormity of what he offered terrified her precisely because she wanted it so desperately. She opened her mouth and found her voice came out trembling, asking him if he truly understood what he was choosing, reminding him that she was 42 years old with silver threading through her hair and lines marking every year of her widowhood visible on her face, that she came with no fortune or connections to enhance his position, that society would mock him, and his family would resent her, and there would be no easy path forward if he bound himself to a woman the world deemed unworthy of him. William listened to every word, and when she finally fell silent, he set the ring box carefully on the small table beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of absolute conviction. He told her that he was not choosing blindly or impulsively, but with full awareness of exactly who she was, and that what he saw when he looked at her was a woman of extraordinary grace and dignity, who had raised a daughter alone on limited means, and done so with such love that Caroline had grown into a woman of character and kindness. He said he saw intelligence in her eyes, and strength in the set of her shoulders, and a capacity for deep feeling that she had learned to hide, but that showed itself in small moments when she thought no one was watching. He told her he had been memorizing her face since that first evening in the garden, learning the lines around her eyes that came from smiling, and the slight crease between her brows that appeared when she was thinking deeply, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life learning the stories behind every mark time had left on her. He said he had lived for duty and obligation and the expectations of others for 48 years, and he had earned the right to choose joy, and his joy was bound up entirely in the woman before him, in Eleanor herself, not in some imagined version of her, but in precisely who she was at this moment, with all her doubts and fears and hard-won wisdom. Then he asked again, in words stripped of formality, whether she would marry him and build a life with him and trust him with her heart. Eleanor felt the truth of his words settling into the Saz, where her doubts had lived for so long, felt something shifting inside her chest like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Yet even as warmth spread through her, the old fears rose up one final time, because accepting what he offered meant stepping fully into a vulnerability she had sworn never to risk again. She looked at William kneeling beside her chair with the afternoon light catching the threads of silver at his temples, and she thought about how completely he saw her, how he had somehow looked past the surface that society judged so harshly and found value in things she had long since stopped believing were worth anything at all. Her voice came out trembling when she spoke, telling him that she was afraid not just of society's mockery, but of her own inadequacy. Afraid that she would disappoint him once the novelty of their connection faded, and he saw her clearly in the harsh light of daily life. She said she did not know how to be a duchess, had no training in managing grand households or navigating the complex social obligations that would come with his position, and that she feared becoming a burden to him rather than the partner he deserved. William listened with such focused attention that she felt held by his gaze, and when she fell silent, he brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles before addressing each fear with the same patience he had shown throughout their courtship. He told her that he did not need a duchess trained from birth in social arts, but rather a woman of intelligence and compassion who would stand beside him as his equal, that he had competent staff to manage households, but no one who could share his thoughts at the end of long days or make him laugh with unexpected observations about human nature. He said he had watched her navigate society with limited resources sources for weeks now and seen how she maintained her dignity under circumstances that would have broken someone of weaker character, and that if she could raise a daughter alone and survive 20 years of widowhood with her kindness intact, then she possessed strength far greater than what was required to bear a title. Then William reached for the ring box again and held it where she could see the way the ruby caught the light, and he told her something that made her heart contract with painful hope. He said that every line on her face was precious to him because each one represented a year of her life, a moment of joy or sorrow or determination that had shaped her into the woman before him, and that he wanted to earn the right to learn the story of every one of those lines over the decades they would have together. He told her that the slight silver in her hair reminded him of moonlight, and that the softness of her figure spoke of a body that had borne life and nurtured it and survived, and that he found her infinitely more beautiful than any smooth-faced girl who had never known real adversity or developed real character. He asked her to trust him, trust that he knew his own heart after 48 years of living, trust that what he felt for her was not passing fancy, but deep recognition of someone who completed parts of himself he had not known were incomplete. Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble like a wall that had stood for 20 years, suddenly revealing itself to be made of sand rather than stone, and she realized that all her careful defenses had been built to protect a heart that was weary of protecting itself, a heart that wanted nothing more than to trust in the earnest devotion she saw burning in William's eyes as he knelt beside her chair with the ring box held between them like an offering at an altar. She drew in a shaking breath and felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded, the movement small at first, and then more certain, and she heard her own voice saying yes, with a conviction that seemed to come from some place deeper than conscious thought, some part of herself that had been waiting in silence for permission to hope again. William's face transformed with such open joy that it took her breath away, and he rose from his knees in one fluid movement to pull her up from her chair and into his arms, holding her against his chest with a fervor that spoke of relief and triumph and tender possession all at once. Eleanor felt the solid warmth of his body against hers and realized she was trembling, realized that 20 years of being untouched had left her half-starved for exactly this kind of closeness. And when William drew back just enough to frame her face with his hands, she saw in his expression the same hunger she felt, the same desperate need for connection that transcended mere physical desire and reached into the realm of souls recognizing their completion in one another. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to understand his intention, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that began with the tentative gentleness of a question and deepened into an answer, as Eleanor responded with a passion she had thought long dead. His mouth moved over hers with increasing confidence as she kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders for balance, as the world seemed to tilt and reform itself around this new reality where she was wanted and cherished and claimed by a man who saw her true worth. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and William rested his forehead against hers, while his thumbs traced the dampness of tears on her cheeks, following the lines that bracketed her mouth and the soft creases at the corners of her eyes, with a reverence that made her feel like something precious being catalogued and memorized. He whispered her name like a prayer and told her he loved her, the words simple but weighted with such sincerity that Eleanor felt them settle into her chest and take root there, pushing out the last shadows of doubt that had lingered in the corners of her heart. She told him she loved him too, her voice breaking on the words, and watched his eyes close briefly as though savoring the sound of her confession. Then William was sliding the ring onto her finger, the ruby catching the afternoon light and glowing like a coal against her skin, and Eleanor stared at it through her tears, thinking that she had never owned anything so beautiful or so significant. This visible symbol of a promise that seemed too wonderful to be real, yet was undeniably solid and present on her hand. William insisted on proceeding with every proper formality, despite the unconventional nature of their match, and Eleanor found herself moved to tears when he appeared at her townhouse the very next morning with a request to speak formally with Caroline and her husband Thomas. Caroline had embraced her mother with fierce joy upon learning of the engagement the previous evening, but now she sat in the drawing-room with Thomas beside her, looking slightly awed as the Duke of Tremaine asked their blessing to marry Eleanor, his manner so respectful and sincere that Thomas stammered his enthusiastic consent, while Caroline wept openly and told William that she had never dared hope her mother might find such happiness again. William thanked them both with genuine warmth and then pulled a folded document from his coat, explaining that he had already instructed his solicitors to draw up settlements that would provide generously for Caroline and any future grandchildren, wanting Eleanor to know that her daughter's security would never be a concern. The gesture touched Eleanor deeply because it showed how thoroughly William understood her heart, how he recognized that her greatest vulnerability had always been her fierce maternal protectiveness and limited means to ensure Caroline's future. Within 2 days, the formal announcement appeared in the Morning Post and the Times, the stark black print declaring the engagement between William Arthur Tremaine, Duke of Tremaine, and Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, widow of the late Mr. James Ashworth. Eleanor stared at her name in the newspaper and felt the surreal weight of seeing her private joy transformed into public knowledge, knowing that every drawing-room in London would now be discussing the match over breakfast tables and afternoon tea. The immediate reactions arrived swiftly in the form of calling cards and notes, and Eleanor was astonished to find the responses more varied than she had anticipated. Yes, there were the expected expressions of shock and disapproval, the pointed absence of acknowledgement from certain society matrons who had already made their disdain clear, but there were also surprising notes of congratulation from women Eleanor barely knew, older widows and spinsters who wrote brief private messages expressing their quiet pleasure at seeing someone like themselves chosen and valued. One note in particular moved her to tears, written by a widow of 55, who said she had spent